I think the lazy analysis around a pharma company right now is COVID-19. It must be good for pharma. But quite clearly, there's real disruption for you as we face the possibility, the prospect of another shutdown. Vas, can you walk me through the concerns you have right now, looking at Europe specifically?
You know, when you look at the dynamics that we're seeing in the marketplace, there's definitely impact from the disruption in healthcare systems. We see that in our generics unit. We see that in certain therapeutic areas like ophthalmology and dermatology. But what we've been very pleased with is the recovery that's happened over the course of the summer, getting patients back in for the care that they need. And you see that in our numbers. You see that in our growth drivers outpacing some of those other therapeutic areas where we're having challenges. Multiple brands growing double-digit, growth drivers now accounting for 50% of our sales. So I think overall, we're in a reasonable position. Now, going into the fourth quarter, we're going to have to see how healthcare systems grapple with the next wave of the pandemic. But I believe that healthcare systems have now learned a lot, learned how to manage the cases better, learned how to keep getting patients in for the care that they need. So overall, we're cautiously optimistic.
Well, walk me through that cautious optimism for Q4. We're about 27 days into it. How much visibility do you have at the moment, Vas, as to whether that momentum, that stability has continued?
You know, when you look at the visits of patients into the healthcare system, what we saw over the course of the summer was a slow recovery from the significant dip that happened in April and May, close to 60 or 70% reductions in outpatient healthcare visits. In September, that had almost normalized. In early October, we did see a slight dip again, but still pretty close to pre-COVID levels. We're watching those metrics very carefully. And what's important is they vary based on the individual therapeutic area. Some therapeutic areas very hard hit, others being able to manage better. I think overall, health ministers, healthcare systems have realized what we can't afford is a second epidemic with respect to COVID. The second epidemic of non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, rheumatological illnesses, taking a huge toll on large swaths of the population who suffer from these conditions. So what we need to do now is strike the right balance, tackle COVID as the cases arise, and then continue to maintain, as close as possible, normal operations of healthcare systems.
Vas, good morning to you. I'm having deja vu as Europe goes back into lockdowns. You were in one of my last in-person interviews and my last time traveling to Switzerland. I want you to put on your different hat now. You worked on the H1N1 vaccine. When we had a mumps vaccine in the late 1960s, it was crazy how quickly we got there. 4 years. Are we getting ahead of ourselves talking about a vaccine the end of 2020, early 2021?
I think it's important to stay humble when we think about the development of medicines and vaccines. It is hard to find novel medicines and vaccines. And in this case, we're searching for a vaccine against a respiratory virus, which in the experience of vaccine developers, I myself have a history of vaccine development, has proven extremely challenging. I think what we can reasonably hope for is we start to generate data, and I'm hopeful that by the end of next year, we'll have solid data on hopefully multiple vaccines that have reasonable safety and efficacy and have adequate volumes of the medicine to be able to treat large populations around the world. What I'm more confident about is what we'll continue to see is incremental improvements in patient care, slowly and surely better medicines to manage patients in the ICU, manage patients in the hospital, continue to get the severity rates down on COVID, and the world will be able to then manage this pandemic and manage getting back to a more normal way of living.
Vas, what about your trials on the monoclonal antibodies? How is that going? I mean, these are very expensive as well, and if it's going well, how do you get it up to production?
You know, I think one of the key things is how you use the medicine in the course of the illness. Clearly, with monoclonal antibodies, whether they're directly on COVID or whether they're for treating the so-called cytokine release syndrome that happens with COVID, you have to target the medicines well. And most of these medicines at these volumes are primarily for patients in the ICU or in the hospital setting. One of the challenges with monoclonal antibodies is we can't scale these up to tens of millions of doses easily. So that creates a natural constraint. So we're going to need new technologies. We're hopeful. We're evaluating a few newer technologies that we hope can get us to very large volumes of monoclonal antibody-like therapies or also looking at oral drugs, and can we use oral drugs as well? Because with oral medicines, we can produce billions or tens of billions of doses of medicine. I think what's important is we're going to need a full range of technologies. We're going to need vaccines. We're going to need monoclonal antibodies. We're going to need oral therapeutics. We're going to need more rapid diagnostics. And incrementally, we'll get to a better place in managing this entire situation for the good of human society around the world.
Vas, I have to say this morning you sound a little bit more confident about the prospects in the future, and that's good news for us all. Back in August of last year, you were on the record as being worried about the possibility of a pandemic. When you look at what policymakers have done so far to make sure that we can accelerate vaccine studies, trials, and ultimately production to roll this out, do you think we're doing enough? And where can we do more?
I think a lot is being done, and I think clearly there's been an immense global collaboration that's happened across the pharmaceutical industry, with governments, with non-government actors, to ensure that we scale up. I co-chair with Bill Gates the Gates collaboration along this effort. We signed a communique to really ensure that we enable equitable access to these technologies. So I think a lot is being done. What's critical right now is we maintain public trust in the process, that we're extremely data-driven, that the public can believe that whatever vaccines and therapeutics are getting approved have very robust data sets. There's going to be a huge push to rush at this moment. And I think what's important for the long run is we have very solid and efficacious and safe vaccines and therapeutics, because what we can't afford is a misstep, lose public trust, and then these technologies are not broadly used. We know what you need to do to prepare for a pandemic. Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say on public trust, Vas, we saw Russia and China already start to roll out their versions of a vaccine. Was that wrong?
I do worry about rushing too quickly for a vaccine, because I think what's incredibly important with a vaccine is you understand the near-term and the long-term or mid-term safety, and that you also ensure that the efficacy is something that stands the test of time. That's not just for a month, of course, that can also last for multiple months. And that data takes time to generate. I understand there's a huge, I think, allure of rushing out with a vaccine. But the other thing we have to remember is when we go too fast, we can also disrupt the ability of clinical trials to occur for even better vaccines down the line. So we've got to strike this balance of making sure that we don't undermine the larger scale effort in our rush to get something out.